On Saturday, the 26th of April 1986, at 1:24 a.m. Moscow summertime, most people in Ukraine were still fast asleep, oblivious to the massive explosion which had just started the world's largest nuclear accident. I am, of course, talking about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which happened over 40 years ago and has redefined nuclear safety. So, what actually happened? The operators of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant were preparing to test the emergency systems of Unit 4, one of the 4 reactors at the plant. They wanted to determine whether the output of the turbine was sufficient to power the feed water pumps that supplied cooling water before backup diesel generators started in the event of a power loss. During the preparation, the reactor power needed to be reduced to 22 to 32% of the total power. And the operators began to reduce the power level at 1 p.m. on the 25th of April. However, this is where the problems began. The computer system that was responsible for controlling the reactor was incorrectly programmed and did not maintain the reactor power at the required 30%. Instead, it dropped to just 1%. Now, in contradiction to what you might think, that was actually a very bad thing. Because when reactor temperature decreases, the water coolant condenses and slows down the neutrons emitted by the reactor fuel. You might need a little bit more context for what that means. Inside nuclear reactors, a fuel, in this case uranium, undergoes fission, where one atom splits into 2 smaller atoms, some neutrons and of course some energy. The neutrons are the important part as they go on to cause further fissions in a chain reaction. But the neutrons produced are travelling way too fast and they need to be slowed down before they can cause other fission reactions. One of the main roles of the operators is to make sure that the chain reaction is controlled by inserting or removing control rods which absorb neutrons and thus change the rate of reaction, which is known as reactivity. Inserting control rods fully absorbs all of the neutrons in the reactor and stops the energy being produced. You might now be able to see the problem. If neutrons are slowed down by the liquid water, then the reactivity increases and the core becomes more uncontrollable. Luckily, the control rods were still inside the core, so nothing happened. That was until the operators removed the control rods to try and increase the power generated, and nothing happened. The reactor power only increased from 1% to 7%. That was still far from the required power level, so what stopped it? Xenon gas. You might remember that the fission of uranium produces 2 other atoms. These in turn decay further, and before you know it, you've got a whole host of atoms in the core. One of them is xenon. Normally it doesn't cause any problems as the xenon decays from the intense conditions inside the reactor. However, if the core reactivity is too low, the gas absorbs neutrons and it prevents the reactor from starting. That's why the reactor power didn't increase. The operators decided, once again, to remove control rods. The idea was, by removing more control rods, there were less neutrons being absorbed and the power should increase, and the xenon would decay away. It did not. Here, human errors steps in once again, and it was decided that the 7% power level was enough for the test. Now, for some context, at this point, of the 211 control rods, only somewhere around 6 to 8 were inserted into the core. And to make matters worse, the safety systems had been disabled to keep the system from performing an emergency shutdown, called a Scram. The operators began the test by cutting the steam supply to the turbine, causing the feed water pumps, now powered by the turbine, to start to run down. The reduction in coolant flow caused the reactor core to rise in temperature and the water coolant started boiling. This increased the reactivity in the system, which in turn heated the water more in an uncontrollable feedback loop. The core was getting hotter and hotter and hotter until the operators realised the situation and pressed the Scram button, inserting all of the control rods into the reactor, which ordinarily would stop the chain reaction. But the Chernobyl reactor had one fatal design flaw, which no one had foreseen. The control rods were tipped with graphite, which increased the reactor power when the rods were removed, but it meant that when the rods were inserted, the graphite tips moved into the centre of the core before the control rod. The thing about graphite is that it slows down neutrons, which is why it increases the power, but also why it caused the reactor to heat up even more whilst the control rods were being inserted. This, combined with the extremely slow 18-second rod insert time, caused the core to rapidly increase in both heat and power, reaching 100 times the normal power level in just 4 seconds, breaking the fuel apart and warping the control rod channels. Then, a massive explosion ripped through the reactor. Steam had built up to uncontrollable levels and burst out the top of the reactor vessel, flinging the top of the shielding straight through the roof of Unit 4. That was the explosion at 1:24 a.m, the result of the worst nuclear meltdown in history. Firemen rushed to the scene to tackle the resulting blaze and the rapidly spreading nuclear material. The situation was finally controlled on the 6th of May, 9 days after the accident, and directly killed 30 people, with many more affected by the airborne radiation that spread over 200,000 square kilometres. Now, that's obviously not the end of the story. International support and cooperation over the last 40 years have enabled the construction of the new safe confinement in 2017, an enclosed arch built and moved to cover Unit 4. The confinement structure is so large that 2 Notre Dame cathedrals could fit inside. Chernobyl is still being decommissioned today, and the site is not expected to be clear of radioactive material until 2086, 100 years after the disaster. So how can we assure that this never happens again? It starts by remembering the disaster and its consequences, not as a reason against nuclear power, but a reason to aim for better standards of safety and operator training. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the governing body for nuclear power, has made many policy changes since the disaster and ensures that all nuclear reactors are built to high standards to prevent future accidents. The takeaway message from me is not to oppose nuclear projects. We need more reliable, long-term energy sources, and nuclear power provides a fantastic alternative to fossil fuels. The vast majority of reactors provide power completely unnoticed, without any accidents and disasters. And it's because of past mistakes that nuclear is now one of the safest forms of energy production, far safer than fossil fuels.